Dr. Henry Alex Sanchez. I'm interested in two aspects of the wellbeing framework: the freedom and opportunity, and distribution.
Yeah.
And in particular, I'm interested in the challenge of poverty, and not only income poverty, but poverty of capability. And I'd be interested for your observations as to how Treasury tackling the challenge of poverty, or do you see it more generally as a responsibility of other social policy areas of government, or do you think that there is a unique Treasury perspective of how to deal with entrenched poverty in particular parts of communities, in particular parts of urban areas, etc., etc.?
Yeah. Well, I would hope that our perspective is not unique, but we certainly do have a perspective on it. It's something that we discuss quite a lot. And I guess for this reason, before coming to the question, the reason that we discuss it quite a lot is that in some areas, it is difficult, I think, to argue that the poverty or the indicators of poverty that exist are simply due to the fact that governments are not throwing enough money at the problem, in some areas. And traditional measures of poverty are in fact traditional measures, usually anyway, of the shape of the tail end of an income distribution. You know, how many sit in the tail end of an income distribution. They're more they provide more of a comment on income distribution than they do on poverty per se. I'm not saying the two things are not linked, they are. I'm just saying that the link between the two things is actually quite difficult to conceptualise, and it's very, very difficult to operationalise if you're thinking about a policy intervention to address the problem. So let me give you an example. Take entrenched Indigenous disadvantage in remote communities. Now, it's probably the case, but that if we were, as a community, to put a lot more public resources, dollars, into those communities, there would be some positive impact that would be measurable over a period of time. But there are people, including people who live in those communities, who would contest that proposition. They would say that if that's all you did, you would just entrench existing problems. You would just make it even more likely that the disadvantage that we observe today will persist in an intergenerational sense. The way that we think about poverty in the Treasury these days is very much in a capability sense. So we would say, we think of poverty as capability deprivation. That is, people are in poverty if they do not have the capabilities that would allow them to choose a life of value and a life that they themselves have reason to value. People who are in that situation, who are denied those capabilities for whatever reason, are in poverty. They could be millionaires at a point in time, bankrupt the very next year with no capabilities to then choose a life that they would, or indeed that anybody else would have reason to value. Society might not want to extend a helping hand to such a person, but you might. There are also many people in Australia of whom it could not be said that they don't have an adequate income to put food on the table, they don't have an adequate income to afford housing in some parts of Australia, but nevertheless, despite that income, they are capability deprived. If you go into any remote Indigenous community anywhere in Australia, it doesn't take long to stumble across somebody who is capability deprived, and usually the capability deprivation is multidimensional, and usually it's not as simple as being income deprived. I went to a remote Indigenous community in Western Australia a couple of years ago, and I found children playing a game with $1 and $2 coins, tossing $1 and $2 coins into gaps in the pavement. That was the currency of their game, literally $1 and $2 coins. should I have concluded from that those kids were not capability deprived? There were about 70 kids in the quadrangle, 3 adults. The adults were off at the races, I discovered. They'd walked for several days to the horse races. The kids were there on their own. I take the view that those kids were capability deprived. They weren't in school and it was a school day. That's just one example. When I inquired further, I was told that the average number of people living in houses in a house in that community was 15. That was the average number of people living in the 3-bedroom house. For that reason, those kids are capability deprived. That's a perspective that in the Treasury we take to this issue of poverty. We see poverty in terms of capability deprivation. And I would suggest that for people interested in designing policy interventions, that's a much more sensible way to think of poverty than poverty in terms of income inequality alone, even though income inequality is an issue that's important for its own sake.